Moving on, we're getting to one of our very important special senses, vision and the eyes. Before we get into vision, we need to look at the anatomy of the eye first. Let's look at the layers surrounding the eye before we go into any particular structures. So we have 3 layers or coats to the eye. The outermost layer, which is what you see, considering it's the whites of your eye, is the sclera. Just underneath the sclera is the choroid, which is where you have a lot of blood vessels and pigment. And then the most inner of these 3 layers is the retina. And this is where you have your photoreceptors for you to be able to detect light. We can also divide the eye into 2 compartments, an anterior compartment, which is further towards the front of the eye, and a posterior compartment, which makes up the bulk of the eye in the back. The anterior compartment is the space between the cornea and the lens, and it has a fluid called the aqueous humor in it. And the posterior compartment, which again makes up most of the eye in the back side, is everything behind the lens, and it has a gelatinous material inside of it called the vitreous humor. So let's look at how these pieces come together. We have the sclera on the very outside. Again, that's forming the white of your eye. The choroid sandwiched in the middle. And you can see it has red and blue for those blood vessels. It also has pigment to absorb any extra light. And then the retina, very, very inside here, we see the retina. Over here we see the cornea and the lens. And so the space between the 2 is called the anterior compartment and has the aqueous humor. And then the posterior compartment is all of this space here. Everything behind the lens here is the posterior compartment with the vitreous humor. Some other pieces we want to point out. We have the optic nerve. Remember, that's cranial nerve 2. That's going to lead into the retina. We have this fovea centralis, which is actually going to have a densely packed amount of cones. And we're going to focus our light in the back of the eye on this spot. We have the ciliary body and the suspensory ligaments that are holding this lens in place. And then we have the pupil, the space here, and the iris surrounding it. So let's go on, let's continue. We have the sclera. Let's go a little deeper. Again, that's forming the white of your eye, and this is going to help maintain shape. It's going to give us some structure and some shape to the eyeball. Now, for the most part, it is the white part of your eye, but there is one transparent part, the cornea. The cornea is part of the sclera, and it is transparent because we need light to get through it. So light needs to pass through the cornea, and the cornea is going to help refract light. So we're going to start focusing that light into the back of the eye. And as we refract that light with the cornea, we're going to send it through the pupil, which is again that little hole that's going to allow light through. We look at the choroid. Again, this is a highly pigmented layer, and that's because we want that pigment to absorb any extra light that the retina can't handle. The iris is part of this, and your iris is the part that is either maybe a chocolate brown or a baby blue or a grass green, depending on what eye color you have. And the iris is not just there to look pretty and to have color, it's also there to help regulate how large your pupil is. So if you were to shine a flashlight in someone's eyes, their pupils would shrink. If you go into a dark space, your pupils expand, and it's your iris that's helping you control that size. Behind the iris, we have the ciliary body, and that's a little muscle that's going to help control the shape of the lens. The lens is our main kind of focusing agent, or focusing structure when it comes to using light. So it's attached to the ciliary bodies, and it's going to change shape to refract and focus light onto that very particular single spot in the back of the eye. If the light is not focused correctly, your vision will be blurry. We'll talk about how that can happen. But your lens actually changes shape to make sure that light is always going to be focused on the same spot in the back of your eye. So the lens, in order to do that, has to be flexible, it has to be transparent, and it has a concave shape. Now we mentioned it changes shape, right? It flexes and changes shape in order to keep light focused in the back of the eye. And the reason it has to change shape is because when you focus on something very close to you, like your computer screen right now, your lens is going to have a different shape than when you look into the distance, maybe across the room or out a window across the street. Your lens is going to change shape so that you can still focus on the object you're looking at. If your lens could not change shape, then you'd be stuck where things would be in focus only at a certain distance, and anything beyond that distance or closer than that distance would appear blurry. And this is a problem that we experience as we age, in that your lens does become stiffer and less flexible, and so because of that, you end up needing glasses as you get older. In my family, most of us wear glasses, but my dad did not have to wear glasses until he got into his 50s, when his lens lost enough elasticity that he needed to get a pair. Right, and so let's look at it, right? So here we're focusing on something in the distance, far away. The lens is going to flatten out to make sure we're focusing light on this one single point in the back of the eye. If we're looking at something close, right, we shift our focus to our papers or our computer screen, much closer object, we're going to round out the lens so that we can maintain that light being focused on the back of the eye in this one single spot. Moving to the retina, this is where we have the photoreceptors, and there are a couple photoreceptors we have. We have rods and cones. Rods are responsible for your black and white vision. They're just sensitive to levels of light, whereas your cones are where your color vision comes from. Now, cones require bright light. It's hard to tell what color something is in the dark. So you need bright light in order for your cones to really fully tell you what's going on. And they're responding to certain wavelengths of light. We have 3 different cones: red, green, and blue. The fovea centralis, that little point we were talking about in the back of the eye, is an area that we see on the retina that has a bunch of cones densely packed together. And that's why we have such good, crisp, clear color vision. Now, that being said, we have those receptors that are coming from the retina, and they're leading to that optic nerve so that we can take this information to the brain. However, where the optic nerve connects, there are no photoreceptors. And if there's no photoreceptors, that means there's no visual information coming in from that spot. We call this the blind spot. You'll be doing a blind spot test when you do your lab. It's kind of a fun little trick. I recommend trying it out, and if you're not succeeding, try it a few times until you find your own blind spot. So here's the retina. Now, kind of an interesting thing is that the retina of humans is seemingly built backwards. There's an evolutionary reason behind that. We won't get into that in this class, but it's kind of interesting. So we have part of the retina kind of here where we have the ganglions, the axons of the ganglion cells here, traveling towards the optic nerve. We have the sclera back here and the choroid right here. And all of this is going to form the retina. The rods and cone cells are actually way back here. So light has to travel through the axons, through the ganglion cells, through the bipolar cell, and then to the rods and cones. So it's kind of interesting. If you look at other organisms, they don't necessarily have the same build. Their build is reverse of this. So it's kind of interesting of why this happened for us. If you're interested, I recommend looking into it. But we won't spend much time talking about that here. It's just an interesting little point. The blind spot is right here where the optic nerve connects. So there are no photoreceptors in this area, which means no visual information exists from this part of the eye. Let's look a little deeper at those rods and cones. Now, rods are, like I said, these are responsible for levels of light. So your black and white vision, your peripheral vision, and your night vision. They are named rods because they have a rod shape. Again, scientists are creative, right? They have a pigment called rhodopsin, and they do require vitamin A for proper functioning. The cones, these are going to help us with our fine detail and our color. Now, these ones do require more light to be available to fully function, and most of them are going to be found in that fovea centralis. Like I mentioned earlier, there are 3 kinds. Red, green, and blue cones are different kinds of pigments that are going to detect those. And again, they are named cones because, just like the rods, they're cone-shaped. Scientists are creative. So let's look at them. Let's look at a micrograph and some images that have been drawn for it. So here's our cone cell. See how it's cone-shaped? And then our rod cell is rod-shaped. Creative. So we look at a summary of the eye structures. We have the sclera, which is that white covering that's protecting, supporting, and giving us shape to the eye. The cornea, which is refracting light. The pupil, which is letting light in. The choroid layer is absorbing any stray light and has blood vessels throughout. The ciliary body is going to hold that lens in place. The iris is going to regulate the pupil size. Then we get to the retina layer. We have the rods, which are going to make your black and white vision possible. The cones, which are going to be responsible for your color vision. And the fovea centralis, which is where we're focusing light so we can have crisp, clear vision. Some other structures that are not part of any particular layer are the lens, which is a really important piece, right? It's going to refract and focus light back on that fovea centralis. The humors, right? The gel-like and fluid-like fillings for both compartments. And then the optic nerve, which is going to take all this visual information and send it to the brain. Now, sometimes things can go a little awry with the eye. Things like color blindness, cataracts, and glaucoma. Color blindness, this is a genetic condition in where one of the cones is not functional. So it's pretty rare for someone to have a black and white vision because that would indicate that all of the cones are non-functional. Most of the time, one of the 3 cones is non-functional. It's usually an issue discerning red and green. Although any combination, of those 3 cones can exist when it comes to color blindness. Now, we mentioned this earlier in another chapter that color blindness was X-linked, right? And so this is the genes that are involved with this are usually found on the X, and so it's very common in males and less common in females. If you don't remember why, I recommend going back and looking through those previous chapters on genetics. Another issue are cataracts. This is where the lens is cloudy and so it can't properly refract light back in the back of the eye. And then glaucoma, this is where the fluid inside the eye is actually under higher pressure. There's pressure building up inside the eye, and that can also cause damage and vision loss. Some other common ones that you probably experience, especially if you wear glasses, are nearsightedness or farsightedness. These have to do with the eyeball's actual shape. If you are nearsighted, your eyeball is long, right? It's a long eyeball. And so it's hard for you to see things that are far away. So nearsighted means you can see nearby, but you can't see far. For me, I'm nearsighted. I can't see things that are far away. I have to wear glasses in order to correct that. So this is what the lenses in my glasses would look like. Farsightedness is the opposite. The eyeball is too short. It's squished in. And so because of that, it's hard to see things that are close, but easy to see things that are far away. So this person would need a lens that looks a little different. On top of that, there's also astigmatism, something I'm also lucky enough to have, where the cornea or the lens is uneven, and so that's going to change how light refracts in the eye. So instead of light getting focused back in that one single spot, it gets bent to another location, and that gives you an uneven or fuzziness to your vision. For those who have astigmatism, one of the common descriptions that I hear and that I've experienced is when you're out at night and you see something like a stoplight or a street light, it looks like a starburst rather than just a light. And so an uneven lens would help correct for that.